We're getting a new React component that, simply put, helps you manage a component's visibility state. Whatever we put inside of the activity component will either be hidden or visible based on the mode that we set. Now that might sound really simple, so you might be wondering why we need a whole new component to do this when we can already do conditional rendering or just hide it ourselves via CSS. Well, the activity component actually has a few hidden tricks up its sleeve that can really help out with your app's performance. So let's take a look at its use cases and also a few potential footguns. To understand activity, let's take a look at a common pattern in React. Say we have some tabs here and each tab loads in its own data, and I've put on an artificial 2-second delay. Each time I click onto one of these tabs, it's going to load in the data and the user is going to have to wait. Now at the moment, this is being done in the traditional React way where we have some state managing which tab is visible, the buttons to go ahead and set that state, and then all we do is do some conditional rendering where if the tab is equal to about, we render in the about tab component. If it's equal to post, render in post, and contact, render in the contact one. What's happening then when we switch tabs, say from about to post, is this whole component here is unmounting and unrendering, and the post component is mounting and rendering onto the DOM. Since each component manages its own data call, that means that each time we switch our tab, that request is going to occur again. We can see that in the console here, where if I refresh the page, we first load in our get about call, then if I click over to posts, it's going to load in get post, and contact, get contact. This also has another side effect where if I were to fill in this form on the contact tab and then switch back to posts and then over to contact, you can see that that form is completely wiped as the component has essentially reset and all of the state values have gone back to their defaults. That's a super annoying user experience. Now there are ways that we can fix this in React at the moment. One of them would be to load all of the data in the top level component, but that can start to get complex and you start to lose track of where state is loaded in. It's really nice to have the state and the data calls happen in the component itself where they're actually going to be used. The other way we can fix this is switching out the conditional rendering for some CSS. In this case, all we're doing is loading in all of the components, but we're just hiding the ones that we don't need based on that state of the tab. What this means is if I go ahead and refresh the page, after the initial data call, we do actually have our posts and contacts loaded in straight away since the components are mounted, and it also fixes our issue where this form here resets when we go back to the tab. This time it doesn't, since the component itself isn't unmounting or resetting. Now that CSS example is almost what the activity component is doing for us, but it comes with a few performance benefits. To use it at the moment, you do have to be on the experimental version of React, and then you import it by using unstable activity, as if experimental wasn't enough to signify that you probably shouldn't be using this in production yet. Using it though is super simple. All we need to do is go to where I had my conditional CSS logic. I'll change the div here for the activity component. We'll change the class name to the prop that activity needs, which is mode, and the mode can either be visible or hidden. So for me, that is a super simple change. So if the tab is equal to about, set the mode to visible, otherwise set it to hidden. I'll go ahead and do that for the rest of the components or just let cursor do it for me. And there we go. We can now take advantage of pre-rendering and saving state in a way that is performant. If we go back to our tabs demo here and refresh the page, you can see that we're waiting for that initial data call. But now if I click on posts and contact, we have the same thing that we had with that CSS hidden approach where posts and contact load in immediately. If we fill in this form and switch back and forth, you can again see that the form is saving its state. What the activity component is actually doing then is any of its children, when its mode is set to hidden, are being pre-rendered. They're just being pre-rendered at a lower priority than any of them that are set to visible. This is something that you wouldn't be able to achieve if you just used the CSS method. We can see that priority effect in the console here. What I've done is I've switched back to the CSS method, but I've set posts as the default tab. Now, when I refresh the page, you can see that getAbout is still called above getPost because it's the first one in our tree and JavaScript just runs in order. When I switch to using the activity component and refresh the page, you can see that getPost is actually the first one that's called in, then getAbout and getContact once the visible content has been taken care of. The other really useful thing the activity component is doing is when its mode changes from visible to hidden, it destroys all of its effects and essentially unmounts, but then it saves the React and DOM state for later. When the mode is then changed back to visible, this saved state is reused and it remounts all of the children by creating all of the effects again. Essentially, you can think of the activity component as unmounting all of its children components, but saving the React state for later. That's what's powering this form over here. So when I fill this out and go back and forth, it's technically unmounting and destroying all of the effects, but it's saving the state that we have in the input. Now don't worry if that's a bit confusing. This is actually one of the footguns that you want to watch out for when using the activity component. By design, effects don't mount when an activity is hidden. This actually helps to reduce the amount of work for a hidden component, but it also ensures that your cleanup functions run when the activity component switches from visible to hidden. This becomes really useful in a demo like this. Say I have two videos that I want to play in tabs. When I refresh the page here, you can see the first video loads in, and if I click over to the second tab, that video loads in as well and starts playing. If I then go back to the first tab, it resets and goes back to the beginning and also has to load in again. That's not the behavior I want. I want it to save where we last were and play from there. Now, if we use conditional rendering like we are at the moment, what you notice inside of the video player is I do actually have an effect here, which should be playing the video when it loads and then pausing the video when it unmounts. The problem is, since the component is unmounting entirely, since we're using conditional rendering, none of this state is going to be saved. You can see that in the play count here, which each time the video starts to play, we add 1 to the play count. When I switch between them, since we're in React strict mode, the mount count is only ever going to be 2, and it can't be higher. Now, one way that we could fix this using the old method would be to use CSS again. The problem with that is one of the videos is always going to stay playing, and we'd have to add in some custom logic for actually pausing it and managing where its state is in the top level component. Instead, we can switch to activity and just simplify this entirely. When we switch out the conditional rendering for the activity component, we get a really nice user experience. As you can see at the moment, the video is playing over here, but if I click over to Elephant Stream, the video is going to start playing and the titles start rolling in. But if I click back to Big Buck Bunny now, there is no loading time and the video is kicking off right from where we left off. This is all thanks to the fact that in the activity component, when it's set to visible, it starts to run its effects, so it sets is playing to true, and then when we set it to hidden, it sets is playing to false and runs the cleanup function for the effect. But since this state is saved in the activity component, it knows where we left off as well. We can see that effect in the console here. If I change the tab, you can see the effect was cleaned up for the Big Buck Bunny tab, and then the effect was mounted for Elephant Stream. You can see it happens twice here thanks to React strict mode, but as I go back and forth, what's happening is the effect is running the cleanup function, but the state is still being saved, and the component essentially being pre-rendered. There we go. Simply put, the activity component is useful for unmounting and remounting a component, but saving its React and DOM state for later. Do you think this is React making up for its past mistakes, or are you happy to see more components to help out with your React performance? Let me know in the comments down below. While you're there, subscribe, and as always, see you in the next one.